wellness revolution starts now.
Welcome to the program. My name is Bryana Burken, pharmacist and physician liaison with Physicians Preference Pharmacy. Today, we are going to talk about one of our compounded products called Nitazoxanide. And chances are that this is an antimicrobial that you probably have been overlooking. And so today, we're going to go ahead and unpack that one by one. Nitazoxanide is considered to be an antiparasitic based on the way that it was originally developed. But we do put nitazoxanide into the bucket of repurposed drugs. So we do have a lot of repurposed drugs on our formulary: sirolimus, methylene blue, amlexinox, nitazoxanide, mebendazole, ivermectin. We have a lot in our lineup. So we went ahead and added nitazoxanide to this as well. So we're going to talk about the history of nitazoxanide because it's really important to understand where it has come from and speeding us up to where we are today and its modern day uses and where the literature and where the research is going. So it was originally developed as an antiparasitic, but now we were looking at its function in SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That's a tough one to treat. Viral infections, always a hot topic, as well as immune modulation, which is bringing the immune system back into balance so that it can function as it's supposed to and help to protect us. So today we'll discuss the history, the mechanism, which is basically how it works, the clinical uses, what we're using it for today, and most importantly, why we're paying attention to it at Physicians Preference Pharmacy. So as a compounding pharmacist, we are always looking at how to bring the body back into balance using the right dosage forms and getting creative with the medications that we can help incorporate into your regimen and be sure that we've only got on your regimen what you need and nothing that you don't. Nitazoxanide is an example of a compounded prescription that is used temporarily and sometimes routinely or cycled through based on your symptoms and your symptom resolution. Because largely that should actually be guiding how we treat and how we support you during your healing journey. So I do want to define and lump together a few terms because I'm going to use this, and this is kind of a content-rich episode. So when we talk about microbes or antimicrobials or parasites, parasitics, what does all that mean? For the general sense, we're going to be referring to microbes throughout this episode as the bad guys that we want to get out. So we're encompassing bacteria, we're talking about viruses, we're talking about parasites. Many of those rely on a host, which I'm sorry to say, but that's you, for them to stay alive. So of course, we want to be sure you don't get the viral infections, you don't get the bacterial infections, and you don't get the parasitic infections. If you have them, what do? We can't just give something that is going to wipe out everything because then we have consequences from that affect the gut. We want to be as specific and intentional as we can with the products that we choose. So going back as early as the 1970s, you can see that this drug, nitazoxanide, has been around for decades. This drug was originally developed and studied for its anti-helminthic properties, which is worm. Helminths are worms. So they were looking at the veterinary use to help fight off worms in animals. Fast forward to the 80s is when we start to see the efficacy of the use of nitazoxanide in tapeworms in humans. And we fast forward to the 90s and we start to see its efficacy and more broadened use as an antiviral product in humans. So we've been having this information for quite some time. Fast forward to 2002, nitazoxanide gains its FDA approval as a brand name Alinea for cryptosporidium and for Giardia. So you don't need to remember those. Basically, those are bad bugs you do not want in your body. So this is not just for the people that live in third world countries. This is not just for people that live in insanitary conditions. Animals, humans can contract these type of infections in large bodies of water, also from person to person. Of course, viruses are shared person to person. So it's not just to do with insanitary conditions. I want to make that very clear. I think at this point, we've really opened up the conversation around parasites in particular, which used to kind of be thought of as a dirty thing. But we realize now everybody has them to some extent. So we just need to face it, and then we need to address it properly. So the key point is that nitazoxanide has been around for many decades, and it's now being repurposed with a broader antimicrobial antimicrobial activity, which again, microbes, bacteria, viruses, parasites, worms, their eggs, all of those need to be addressed. So how does nitazoxanide work? We always want to understand at a deeper level how what we're taking is working so that we know if it actually is working or not and what are our expectations, what is it supposed to do? Let's talk about the pharmacology or how it works a little bit, but in simple terms. So nitazoxanide is functioning as an antimicrobial, but it actually importantly is what we call a prodrug. So there are many drugs that are available or medications that are available that we consider to be a prodrug, which you can kind of think of this as a pre-drug. You take that medicine in, let's say in this case in an oral capsule form, and what you're taking is the active ingredient nitazoxanide inside of that capsule. It very quickly gets broken down into its active form or active circulating metabolite, which is what's flowing throughout your body and doing what it's supposed to do, and that's called Nitazoxanide. So if you go reading on the internet about nitazoxanide and its bioavailability or how much it's absorbed, you'll see it's exceptionally low. What we're interested in is what Nitazoxanide is doing. So the drug is nitazoxanide. That's your prodrug. It very quickly gets metabolized to Nitazoxanide in the body, which is what is doing the heavy lifting. Now, as far as how this works, nitazoxanide has a few different special or unique aspects that make it so effective and also very shielded against resistance. We talk about antibiotic resistance and why that is a big problem. Eventually, if you keep going antibiotic after antibiotic after antibiotic, you're going to run out of them, and eventually you're not going to have any more antibiotic choices left to treat the infection. So the primary mechanism around how nitazoxanide works is that it inhibits something called, pyruvate ferredoxin oxidoreductase. We'll just call it PFOR for short, or P4. So P4 is really important in how microbes, or those bad guys, try to survive in the body. What it does is it allows those microbes to have their own metabolism when they're living in areas of the body that are shielded from oxygen. We call that anaerobic. Aerobic is in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic is not in the presence of oxygen. Obviously, not all living beings can be present in the place of oxygen. So they have to morph, they have to adapt, they have to find their own mechanisms to still be able to survive. And in many cases in the GI tract, there are areas where anaerobes live, and they can be very difficult to treat, and they cause a lot of symptoms for folks. So this P4 enzyme that is inhibited by nitazoxanide, it essentially shuts down or cuts off that metabolism of those microbes so that they cannot function as they want to, which is not beneficial to us. Now, why this matters clinically is that, again, many of those gut microbes live in areas in the absence of oxygen. What happens, though, is that when those microbes have their own internal metabolism, they survive and produce through fermentation and also through anaerobic respiration, which is breathing. It's basically how they breathe, but it's in the absence of oxygen. What happens is that gases are created, and also they're trying to break down or survive on glucose to make energy. All living beings have to make energy. We make energy in the form of ATP. They try to do the same thing, but they just use different building blocks to get there. So it's important to understand what mechanisms are we shutting down. The reason I paint this picture for you is because some drugs go after the bad guy itself, which would be, let's say in this case, a virus or a bacteria. In other situations, like with nitazoxanide, it will actually help to support your immune system so that you can fight off those bad guys better. This is why it helps to shield us against resistance. If we just go after the bug with the drug, we will oftentimes end up with resistance to that drug, and then you don't respond. So nitazoxanide has a really good broad spectrum of activity as well. So it's not just for one or two viruses. I have a list here, and it's extensive, really. It works as an antiprotozoal, it works as an antihelminthic, those are worms, antimycobacterial, which is kind of like antimicrobial, and then antiviral. So some that you may be familiar with would be H. pylori, also Giardia, and cluster C. diff, actually. So this is something that when I first was learning about nitazoxanide, I was very surprised that when we have very expensive and difficult to treat issues like C. diff, which will confine people to the hospital, nitazoxanide actually has shown proof to work in C. diff. So that's really important information. Also as an antiviral. So from the most basic, like influenza A, influenza B, also COVID, also RSV, parainfluenza, rotavirus, norovirus, and hepatitis or Hep B and C, which can also be difficult to address. So a very broad spectrum of how nitazoxanide works. Now, aside from inhibiting this P4 enzyme, that PFOR, which talks about the anaerobic metabolism, we also talk about immune signaling effects, which is what I mentioned here. So nitazoxanide has the ability to turn off or tamper down how much of an immune response the body is mounting when you are exposed to said microbe. The reason that's important is the immune system should be kept in balance. It should never be way too revved up, and we should not be immunocompromised where we have no immune system or immune function at all. So we're working on reducing the cytokine reaction. You may have heard of cytokine storm. We talk about that a lot when we are infected with a virus. It's just way too much of the immune response happening at once, and you will feel worse rather than feeling better. It's an inappropriate immune response. We want an appropriate immune response instead. So instead of nitazoxanide attacking the microbe, like the virus or like the bacteria or like the parasite, it works on that microbe's metabolism first, but it also supports the immune system so you can fight it off better. I'm going to explain this a little bit more as I unpack which viruses specifically we will address with nitazoxanide. So use number one would be influenza, something that we are all familiar with. That's the flu. Now, the mechanism of how nitazoxanide works in influenza is different than what you may have taken in the past from your retail pharmacy, like Tamiflu, oseltamivir. That's something you can go to the pharmacy and pick up, and what it does is you use it as quickly as you can after you know that you test positive for flu so that it can interject and address the virus itself. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, these microbes, they're super tricky, they're super smart, and they have a way of tricking your natural healthy cells to saying, it's fine, you can let me in. Those viruses, those bacteria, they want to be intracellular. They want to be inside of your healthy cells because, again, they require a host to survive. So they can't just be floating around in the air forever. They require assembly and entry into your cells to reassemble, for example, viral particles so that they can work appropriately, but they have to bind to the receptor of the cell and gain entry. This is how we talk about how viruses and bacteria, et cetera, actually alter the immune response because they're trying to trick your immune system. So rather than us using something like Tamiflu, which specifically addresses how your healthy cells hang on to that virus or not, they don't allow the virus, it doesn't allow the virus to be kicked off your healthy cells, which would lead to viral spread or infection. That's how something like Tamiflu works. But nitazoxanide actually disrupts something called the hemagglutinin maturation. Again, we are talking about how the virus binds, but it interrupts proper viral assembly. So if you've ever watched a video on viruses and how they work, there are different types, but basically they have kind of like a rocket ship, different parts that must fit together and parts that get lopped off as they go through their normal function. If we do not allow it to actually be assembled correctly because we're helping to support our own immune response and immune recognition, then we actually can have a reduced viral load because they never got assembled to work and do their damage in the first place. It basically leads to defective viral particles, which is what we want. So possible advantage here, it actually may help, nitazoxanide may help work against Tamiflu resistant strains. So again, when we run out of options, we always want to bring in new options if we can have them. That's why we love our repurposed drugs so much. Number 2, SARS-CoV-2, aka COVID. All familiar with this. Some possible mechanisms of how nitazoxanide can actually work in the SARS-CoV-2 virus is that it interferes with something very important of the pathophysiology of SARS-CoV-2, which is the spike protein. So if you look at a photo or microscopy image of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, you'll see, like with a lot of other coronaviruses, because this is not the first coronavirus, it's SARS-CoV-2. So you actually see the spikes that are relevant and present on the outside of that virus. That is really important, or those spike proteins are really important for dictating how and where that virus binds, because it has certain areas it really likes to bind, like the central nervous system, the spine, the nerves, the brain. It absolutely loves the fat. It loves your reproductive organs, which is where we see the biggest problems, which is where that virus likes to go, where that spike protein likes to go, and where it likes to replicate. The fat actually serves like a replication factory for the spike protein, which means you make more and more and more. And yes, the virus will make you sick, but you're not going to have the virus sticking around for years, but the spike protein does, which is why I think it's so important for this to be addressed, for it to be tested, for us to understand what your total spike protein load is. How much of it is in your body? How much is it still lingering post-vaccination or post-natural infection? So we want to be sure that when we use something like nitazoxanide, we can address the spike protein maturation. We don't want the spike proteins maturing. We don't want them in your body. We want them out. And we have a lot of tools to get them out, but we need to know how many are in there before we decide what type of treatment that we go for. So just to be clear, the research is definitely ongoing and still evolving for nitazoxanide's use in SARS-CoV-2, but this information is not new. You can go back decades and see its antiviral activity. And this is not new information. It just hasn't broken the internet or got popular yet, I suppose. But we do know that it has a possible place in therapy simply based off of how the drug works. Nitazoxanide also activates host antiviral genes. So yes, you have genes in your body that help your body to recognize viruses and bacteria and pathogens appropriately and then determine your immune response to those. Nitazoxanide can help to support those or activate those genes and their function. Also, it can help to reduce pro-inflammatory cytokines. So again, we go back to cytokine storm. We don't want that. We want the appropriate immune response, not too much or an over-exaggerated immune response that will do you more harm than good. Use number 3, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, just like it sounds. You've got your large intestine, you've got your small intestine, and in your small intestine, you have bacterial overgrowth if you have something called SIBO. Now, SIBO is something that historically has been very difficult and very expensive to treat, and so anything that we can add to our regimen is really good. It can span from a very heavily weighted herb regimen to antibiotics, which can run people thousands of dollars a month, and it's very difficult to keep up with. Not to mention that if we have repeated antibiotic use, we can run into antibiotic resistance, and we really don't do the gut too much of a good service. Yes, we want the bacteria out, but then when we start wiping it clean of everything, we have other problems too, which allow other microbes to grow. So it's a bit like a hamster wheel when we're treating the gut like that, just with antibiotics. Now, those that have SIBO, they can have a blend of dysbiosis or a blend of a lack of balance because of different microbes that are present in the gut, making them present different ways. And what I mean by that is some people might have a lot of gas, they might have a lot of cramping, they have a lot of food intolerances, and these are things that we want to address with the treatment of SIBO. So common features would be bacterial overgrowth, that anaerobic fermentation. So those really tricky guys that don't actually need oxygen, so they can bury themselves in the tissue or the walls of the gut and just wreak havoc on the gut. Some of the advantages that we see for nitazoxanide is that it has broader coverage or does more things than one of our go-tos for SIBO, which is the drug rifaximin or Xifaxan, which can be very expensive as well. That's an antibiotic. And that's because nitazoxanide also has not just activity against bacteria, but anaerobes and protozoa as well. It also disrupts that fermentation, so it's going after those anaerobes themselves and actually how they function. Think about if something came after your metabolism. You're not going to be able to make energy, you're not going to be able to make oxygen, you're going to feel terrible, you're going to feel fatigued, and that's exactly what we want to do to the bacteria. We don't want the bacteria doing that to you. Also, something we don't talk about too much, but nitazoxanide in terms of SIBO can actually help to impact biofilm organisms. So these little microbes or organisms that we don't want in our body, again, they have their own metabolism. They have their own internal waste and waste products and metabolites that they put off or they leave in their path. And sometimes the repercussions of that are what we refer to as biofilm. So it's like a living film. Sometimes that can form in the nose is really common. It loves the mucosal areas, which is why it will live up in the nose. Also the GI tract, we can have biofilms in there, and those are tough and nasty to treat. But nitazoxanide may have activity against those biofilms. So what happens when people take nitazoxanide for the treatment of SIBO or in their SIBO treatment regimen? What we've seen, they usually get less bloating, as I mentioned, better bowel regularity, which is really important because the bowels are one avenue that our body utilizes for appropriate and regular detoxification. If we're not moving it through, then we have toxic buildup. You will, in short time, start to feel very bad. So we need the bowels moving. Also, reduced food intolerances, very important, especially when we're talking about the gut. If we have food intolerances and gut issues or symptoms, that's a catch-22 because we need to nourish you. But if you're not tolerant of many foods, we don't have many options, we'll run out of them pretty quickly. Also, you will become malnourished. And even if you're overweight, you can still be malnourished. So just being very thin or excessively thin is not the only indication for malnourishment. Also, improved motility. So just making sure things are going, that the GI tract is contracting as it should be, and again, moving bowels through regularly. So let's wrap up here with some thoughts on dosing and comments on safety. With repurposed drugs, we generally see a very high safety profile for them because we're talking about them being repurposed, meaning they've been around for a long time, and we have a long history to stand on of safety and efficacy, and generally the studies are ongoing. So we make nitazoxanide in an oral capsule form. Now, as with most antiparasitics or drugs that were initially developed as an antiparasitic, we recommend that you take them with food because it will help to increase the absorption. Doesn't have to be a big meal, just something that is food. Sometimes something that's high fat can also be helpful to increase the absorption of it as well. And then as far as the expectation for duration of dosing, it's largely dependent on age. So something like ivermectin is usually weight-based dosed. Nitazoxanide is FDA approved for those over 1 year of age. So if you're treating a 1-year-old versus a 3-year-old versus an 8-year-old or a 58-year-old, the dose is likely going to go up based on how old you are, but the duration or how long you take it, how many days you take it, will be dictated by the severity. So how bad are the symptoms? Is it recurrent? Do we know that it's treatment refractory, meaning we've tried everything else and it's not working? Is it a really bad infection? That will all dictate if it's going to be somewhere between usually 3 days or 14 days. So that's the general expectation for the duration of treatment we're considering here. And lastly, focusing on safety. So we always have to look at side effects as well. Typical side effects that we would see really with any oral capsule that would go through the GI tract for nitazoxanide. So potentially headache, abdominal pain, diarrhea, rash. But I just want to point out that when we talk about these things and you see this information on the leaflet that you receive with this prescription, we're required to put that there based off of what the FDA approved drug has shown in people. But oftentimes the incidence of this is less than 1% to 2% of people actually experience it. So I don't want you to feel turned off when you read that information. It's just another data point that we have to be informed about the medications that we're taking. Of course, if you have an allergy or a hypersensitivity to nitazoxanide, then we don't want you taking that. Otherwise, it's a very safe drug. Now, just in closing here, I want to remind you, nitazoxanide is repurposed. It's something that's been around and being studied since the 70s, and we're starting to see it crop up more for viral use, for SIBO, for influenza. Viruses are always a hot topic. Parasites are always a hot topic, which is why we come to you talking about this today. So be sure that you share this episode with your physician, with your prescriber. They can call us, of course, if they have questions. If you have questions for us directly, for myself or any of the other pharmacists at Physicians Preference Pharmacy, we would love to answer them for you. Please feel free to give us a call at 281-828-9088, and it would be our privilege to serve you. At Physicians Preference Pharmacy, we believe that prescription drugs are commonly overprescribed, treating symptoms only rather than addressing the underlying condition. These drugs offer a temporary fix, but they don't solve the root cause of the problem. Our approach is not about overloading people with medications that offer only a temporary fix. It is so important to recognize that you do not get sick because you have a low level of pharmaceutical drugs in your blood. You get sick because you are deficient in something or because your body is not in balance. As part of your healthcare team, we work with your doctor to restore that healthy balance. Sometimes this means replacing hormones, vitamins, nutrients, or even antioxidants. So how is this different than traditional treatment? Rather than covering up the symptoms with yet another medication, we work to replenish the body, restoring your health and restoring your wellness.
Information provided on this program is neither intended nor implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice and is not intended to replace the services of a physician, nor does it constitute a doctor-patient relationship. You should not use information from this radio program to diagnose or treat a health problem or disease without consulting with a qualified healthcare provider. If you have or suspect you have an urgent medical problem, promptly contact a professional healthcare provider or call 911. Dr. Hotze's Wellness Revolution advises you to always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider prior to starting any new treatment or with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Any application of the recommendations from this program is at the listener's discretion.